to the Autofocus Literary Podcast. I am still Michael.
And I am barely Ryan.
You all right? Let's unpack that.
I'm great.
What's going on?
Every time we start a podcast. Last time it was my mustache. This time I'm blonde. And I'm in the hand tattoo club now.
You look great.
Thanks.
The tattoo looks
things
great.
have happened. I appreciate it. And I feel like every time we do a podcast, something changes. So, it's great.
Well, if you're following along on YouTube,
we have a YouTube channel.
You can follow along with Ryan's identity crisis.
Quarter life, I guess, maybe. I don't know.
Oh, man. I've got more of the midlife one going. Oh, no, I'm coming out of my midlife one. So
coming out of your midlife?
Yeah, I've been coming out of my midlife crisis for a long time.
All right.
I hit it a little
Good
early.
luck to me, I guess.
Should we say that this literary magazine is like an extension of the last part of my midlife crisis?
No.
Is it?
Let's not unpack that right now.
I think I just said that on the recording.
Shit. Yeah, no.
Okay. Well, anything else going on?
Not really. How about you?
I got a lot going on.
Oh yeah.
But I don't really know what's going to happen. So I might be moving, I might not be moving.
Yeah, big things.
A lot of things are like, I'm supposed to find out a lot of different things soon. This is really cagey and weird. I probably shouldn't even say it on a recording, but whatever, it's recording. I don't feel like starting over.
I get at least one call from you basically daily that I almost look forward to now. And I'm just like, all right, what's new? What's happening? Is everything okay? And as soon as you say something crazy happened, I expect one thing and it's a total 360 pivot. But it's just something else
different now. Yeah. But anyway,
this
episode's not about us. This episode is about two different writers, both of whom had books published with Burrow Press this year. One is Ariel Francisco, who wrote a book of poems called A Sinking Ship is Still a Ship. And the other is Alysia Sawchyn, whose book with Burrow Press is called A Fish Growing Lungs. This is a book of essays. And in our episode that you're going to hear, we just basically have an organic conversation. Well, first, a little bit about their books, but then an organic conversation about all things autobiographical writing in poetry and an essay and really all sorts of stuff. And I really enjoyed the conversation. I like to think they did.
Yeah, I did too. This was one of those where afterwards I feel like it was really late when we recorded, but
it's always late when we record.
Because
I have my kids. But anyway, sorry, I cut you off.
No, but it's just like it was like late, and but afterwards I felt so energized and like I felt really good after this interview.
Yeah, so did I. So Burrow Press is one of my favorite small presses out there.
Yeah.
And they just started their new round of subscriptions for the 2021 catalog. So I encourage you to check out the new books they're coming out with this year. They look really cool, and it's a great way to support them and to get some really cool stuff in the mail. So, I mean, last year I didn't know who Ariel and Alysia were, and I got their books in the mail, and I was like, wow, these are great. And now we're talking to them on the podcast. So you never know what's going to happen if you get this subscription from Burrow, I suppose.
It was great. And I especially appreciated, both readings, which are on our YouTube page too. But it was really cool to see like some of the best moments I personally found from their book. I know Ariel asked too, like for us to pick our favorite poems that he could read, which is really cool. So,
well, I don't know that he asked. We made requests.
I don't recall that.
And he allowed us to.
Is that what happened? I totally forgot. Yeah.
That's the way I remember it. I was like, could you read this one?
Yeah. Oh, and then I just chimed in at the end, like, hey, by the way. Yeah, you're right.
Alysia had one too. So if you're not familiar with what we're talking about, when we have people on the pod, we try to get them to do like a 5-minute reading from their work, and then we throw it up on our YouTube channel, and we encourage you to check those out as well. In addition to our new issue 3, which is on autofocuslit.com right now. We have 2 poems and our longest essay yet, and it's all wonderful work. As always, of course, we're biased.
Yeah, I know. It's like, so I'm gonna tie this into my tattoo.
Okay, please do.
Like every time I get a tattoo, I'm like, oh, that's my favorite. But then I look back, I'm like, but they're, whatever. I just feel like each issue I get more excited. I don't know. I get really excited with these
Well,
now.
that's the way it's supposed to be, right?
Yeah.
But we're also just, outdoing ourselves every time, as if we're really outdoing anything. We just like
Yeah.
what we're doing, I guess.
Yeah.
Is that okay to say? We really like what we're
Yeah,
doing.
it's fun.
And we really love the pieces we've been publishing.
Damn it.
And we
like
have
really
some,
love.
yeah, and we have some really great stuff coming.
Look, I know
next
I'm
month.
a Cancer sun and a Scorpio moon. Sorry, I cut you off.
I don't even know what that means, so I want you
just
to.
And so I'm like, basically just I'm an emotional wreck as is. Like I watched Love, Simon 4 times and I cried every time. And in these pieces too, specifically like that we just published. I mean, like they're all so. This is an emotional issue.
It's a powerful
in like the best way possible. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
Well, anything else before we move into our conversation? I feel like I'm usually the one who forgets something. So
okay, I got you. Ready? Twitter, Instagram. We're on those.
We are on those.
Give us a follow.
At Autofocus Lit.
Oh yeah, thank you. Sorry. Give us a follow. And if you feel so inclined, submit.
Yes, please. So we're taking submissions. So we're also taking submissions. If you go to our About page, we're also taking panel submissions for the podcast. So one thing we're going to be doing is, obviously we have these ones where we interview writers with books recently out. But conference type panels that you might have done at like AWP or something like that. You can actually submit to us, and if we think it's right for us, essentially, we'll basically turn the podcast over to you, and we'll stay out of it, and then release it. Basically, cut an intro for it, and so check out our About page if that sounds good to you, and if not, then don't worry about it, okay? And then eventually you'll hear a panel that we have nothing really to do with. Perfect. And that's about it. All right, so without delay now, and I don't think we're forgetting anything else.
I don't think so, but if there is, next episode we'll mention it.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so here is our conversation with Ariel Francisco and Alysia Sawchyn. All right, so I know both of your books came out with Burrow Press this year in 2020, and I know Alicia's here is A Fish Growing Lungs. You call it your orange baby, right?
I do, my orange baby.
Would you tell our listeners, in your words, about the book?
Yeah. So I guess in my own words, when I first started writing this, I had always thought of it not so much as an essay collection as like linked essays, so more like a linked story collection, but that doesn't really exist in the nonfiction branding world.
Right.
But since I get my own words, like in my heart of hearts, like that's what it is. That's how I understood it to be. And it's about misdiagnosed bipolar disorder, and it takes apart the various symptoms, conditions that led to that misdiagnosis and sort of the unraveling of that.
Yeah, hearing you kind of describe it as like the linked essay story thing, I almost like when I read it, I felt like you could call it like a memoir and essays. Does that?
I think Ryan called it that at one point.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Ryan, if you're not familiar, Ryan Rivas is the publisher of Burrow Press. You're good.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I have strong opinions about like what we call things, and in that I think it's dumb most of the time. That's my strong opinion, is I think it's dumb. And often it's just like a way to sell books, but right. Yeah, I think memoir and essays could also work for it. The reason it's not that I don't like the term essay collection. I do like that term, but there's some essay collections that are like, really close knit, and they like cleave really tightly around like a central idea or event. And then there are some essay collections which are literally just like a deep sea trawler of like an author's writing over the past 20 years or something. And both are wonderful, but like they're, it doesn't help me when I pick up a book and they're like, oh, it's an essay collection. I'm like, cool. Not helpful,
And
like it's a
what
novel.
kinds of essays? Even.
And then it's like, you go to a bookstore and you see fiction. And then I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, where do I go if I want to find a specific kind of nonfiction? You know what I mean? Like that's the dilemma there too.
Yeah, you go to a Barnes and Noble and then there's like thousands of rows of fiction and then there's like this like tiny little section with like essays. It's so depressing.
And
it
like
makes me so upset.
I worked at Barnes and Noble in high school, and
yeah, I worked there, not in high school, but yeah.
I worked there in college.
Everyone's like,
gosh.
Ariel, you want to make it 4?
I worked at Book Culture, so bookstore.
All right, we'll keep.
Okay,
We'll work, make it work.
Yeah.
But so the reason I mentioned, maybe I know it's a weird term, but like a memoir and essays is because it feels like when you're reading the essays that there's like the kind of like all of them together kind of make like the almost like a traditional memoir arc where there's like it like starts with trouble and then kind of like toward the end of the book there's more like the healing going on. Does that sound right to you, or am I?
Yeah, absolutely. It was like I didn't want a straight up traditional memoir, with like the redemption arc and like and then she got married. But I also like felt like I wanted to give the reader still a sense of the arc, even if the arc is like, a treadmill, like the progress you make on a treadmill or something. Yeah. So yeah, and they are like chronological, like loosely in the way that I understand them. So
and I know the title of the book, which is such a great title, it's like a line that appears in 2 different essays, right?
Yeah.
But I know that, so the reason I'm bringing it up is because I've seen, I don't know if it's like, you say it in the book or in the acknowledgements, or maybe I saw it online, but like you say like you're not good with titles, or you hate titles or something.
Yeah, you saw that online probably.
Oh, okay, I can't remember.
Yeah.
So how did the title come about? I guess is what my question is.
Yeah, so I have what I like to call a jukebox brain. And so by that I mean like the first 20 to 40 titles I come up with are just like bad puns of other titles. And so the original title for this manuscript was Notes from the Cliff Face. And that was also originally the title of the cocaine essay in my book. And that was what it got accepted under, but I never like loved the title. And at a certain point, Ryan Rivas and I were talking, and he could just tell that I was like unsatisfied with it. And so I was tasked with coming up with like a bunch of different title possibilities. So I literally had to like go through, reread my book again and come up with like a list of like 40 more titles. And Ryan and I pretty much just like went down the list, and this was the one we liked the best. And then part of the revision process then afterward was just like going back through and like making a few small tweaks to like cohere the fishiness. So for example, the gutted essay was not originally titled Gutted. Deep Sea Creatures, not originally titled Deep Sea Creatures. And like nothing about the essay substantially changed, but it's just like these small things, thinking about the book as a whole object rather than just like, taking 12 discrete things and putting them between 2 covers.
That is important to me in reading essay collections. I know you said they're both great, but I personally have trouble getting through books where there's no kind of thematic link between the essays, where it's all like I guess you can kind of read them however you want, but so I like when I read an essay collection, I like to be compelled to read them in order and to feel like there's some sort of movement between the 2. But to segue, I guess, another very well titled book is this one here. If you're watching on YouTube, Sinking Ship is Still a Ship. And so Ariel, if you would tell us in your own words about your book.
Yeah. So on the surface, it's a collection of poems about how much I hate Miami and how much I hate Florida, and how absurd it is to live in a place that's literally sinking and no one seems to care, you know. But really, and what's been kind of fun, I think, because it came out after I left Florida, and people's reaction seems to me that it's a book with a lot of love and a lot of like deep-seated emotions towards the place, which is true as well. So it kind of holds, you know, it's, I've described it before as this, as like a teenager yelling at his stepdad, right? Like, you're not my real dad. It's kind of one of the vibes of the book. It's like, I'm in the wrong, you know, like the emotions feel real, but also like, I'm sometimes in the wrong there with how I feel about it. And yeah, the book really came out of, I think, not so much that I disliked it, but that I had been there too long. I moved to Orlando from New York when I was 5, and then we moved to Miami when I was 11, because my parents split and my mom got remarried. And so being in Miami was always a negative thing to me, right? Because it was, you know, impossible to kind of separate that from what happened with my parents. So I always disliked it from the very beginning. You know, you can imagine me, I was like 11, like in middle school, just like this miserable little kid, just like unhappy with the place that I was in. And I stayed there for too long. I wanted to come to New York because it was my hometown. I have a lot of family here, but also for like all the writing and art stuff, and on a very practical level because I hate driving and I wanted to live in a place where I could walk around. Where I lived in Miami, you know, it was like a 15-minute walk just to get to the bus stop, just to get somewhere, you know. The book really came out of living in Miami for I'm bad at math, 17 years, 11 to 28, which is, you know, more than enough time to be in a single place, and kind of writing my way out of Florida. I think that's what really happened. It was just like, I'm out of here, you know, kind of not really burning the city down while I'm leaving, but kind of a little bit, or at least pretending to.
Mm-hmm.
And something, there's a poem in my first book called Magic City Ruse, which I remember bringing it to workshop, and my teacher, Kemmel McGrath, his immediate reaction was like, this is way too bitter. Like, what's going on here? But then upon reading again, he was like, well, no, it's kind of like so exaggerated that it kind of works. And that poem opened the floodgate to this book, because I didn't know that I was doing that. That poem came out of literally driving to South Beach because it's Miami. One of the best poetry venues is this fancy hotel on South Beach. And it was a poetry reading at like 7 p.m. on a Friday night. And it took me like 45 minutes to get there and another 45 minutes to find parking. And I was just like in a rage. But that gave me this kind of poem writing space where I could be like, you know, nobody really thinks I want the city to sink into the ocean. But when you say that, it kind of expresses this kind of hyperbole of feeling, right? This sort of, it's so exaggerated that you can't think, you know, I'm not like a super villain, you know what I mean? Yeah, so it was kind of fun to write some of these sinking city poems. Yeah,
and to jump in real quick, as someone who's lived in Florida all my life, West Palm area, so kind of south, not Miami, but it made me reconceptualize, kind of take a step back as someone who's not from Florida, looking at it. You know, you get like the Art Basel and the pastels of Key West. And then the thing that stuck with me, I forget what poem it was in, but the phrase, the great rotting flower, like that's something that I'm just like, so like specific and like visceral to me as that. So it was really interesting to kind of get that new concept of a place I'm so familiar with.
Right. Yeah, that's been part of the fun too. I think people from Florida read the book one way, and people who have never been there, it's like, oh, this is a different side of the stereotype that I see on TV, you know? So that's been a really cool reaction also. Yeah.
I want to ask you about so for readers not familiar, it's a bilingual book. For
Yeah.
each poem, on one side there's your poem, and then on the other there's the Spanish translation. So I wonder if you could talk about kind of how that came to be. So I know you're a translator, and but you didn't translate the book. Um,
Yeah.
so I guess my question is a few, and I'll let you go on it. But like, do you know the translator? And then the other thing I was thinking, or my question is kind of like, is there like in the translation world, which I know absolutely nothing about, unfortunately, is there some sort of like ethical thing against translating your own book? Or has anyone, like, I know there are writers who translated their own books before, like Nabokov has translated his own books before, but at least I think he has. Did it ever come up that you might translate it, or how did you choose the translator? And I suppose just all those things I said.
Yeah.
From there.
So it's kind of insane and very, I think, indicative of how I do things, which is like very it's like part disciplined and hardworking, but also incredibly sloppy and just kind of chaotic. So the book originally had a different press. It was the same press that did my first book, and we had a falling out. I won't get super into it, but I had it was a whole thing with the guy who runs the press. Basically, I didn't want to be associated anymore, and so the book didn't come out when it was supposed to. I'm forgetting even now. I think it was supposed to come out maybe in the spring of 2019 or sometime that year, and I pulled it, and it was in like the proof process and everything when I pulled it from them, and it wasn't bilingual at the time, right? So I was kind of sending it out again and querying places, and I had a friend who was doing some online stuff for Burrow because they have like a small lit mag component. So he was some kind of online
Florida.
editor. Say again?
I was just saying Fantastic Floridas.
Yeah. I don't know if he was the editor for that, but it was he was involved somehow. So I hit him up. He was a classmate of mine at FIU, and I asked him if when Burrow is open for submissions, because I had this manuscript now that was kind of floating, and it would be a perfect fit, a Florida book for a Florida press. And he offered to show it to Ryan, and then Ryan really liked it, and then so we got in touch that way. And since the book had been delayed, I just thought it would be awesome to do it bilingually. And I had originally wanted my dad to translate it because my dad's a poet. I wanted him to translate my first book, and it came out in 2017. And now 2 years later, he had done like 10 poems. And I was like, all right, he probably can't deal with a time frame. We had a pretty tight time frame. Because when they got the book versus when they wanted it to come out, relative to when it was supposed to come out, right? So we had like 6 months, maybe less, to try and get it translated. So I quite literally, I went on Twitter and I was like, hey, does anyone want to translate my book in Spanish? And Nico reached out, and I didn't know him at all, and he messaged me, and he messaged me with a translation of my poem that had been in the New Yorker, as like a sample. And I thought it was great. And I was like, oh, this is awesome. And he gave us a draft in like a month. It was incredible. I don't know how he works or like how that happened. But we just managed to knock it out. We couldn't quite. So if, so like the galleys were not bilingual because it wasn't quite ready at that point. That's how much the timeline was kind of compressed. But he really nailed it. I mean, it was really incredible. And because I also translate, I know that translators need space, and the translation is the translator's creation.
Mm-hmm.
So I let him do whatever he felt he needed to do. There was very little meddling or editing that I did to his translation. I think really it was only objective things like a proper name, right? Or like something that he misunderstood in a very literal way. But very few of those. And I would never, to your other question, I would never translate myself, I think, because it's so bizarre to me. To be honest, it would
Yeah.
just be like kind of like if you looked in the mirror and your reflection moved, but you didn't. It's kind of like, wait,
Huh.
what? What is happening here? Yeah, and it's just kind of awesome to release the work to someone else in that way, you know. So the translations are his. It's like someone else's version of my work is super super interesting to me.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, and because it's a Miami book, I forgot to mention. I mean, that's one of the big reasons I wanted it to be in Spanish. Also, is because Miami is a bilingual city. It's a multilingual city, really. And one of the coolest thing that's happened is friends of mine buying the book for their parents, who mostly are only read and speak in Spanish. Not because they have a particular interest in poetry, but just because, you know, the book is really for them. It's where they live and in the language that they speak. That's been the coolest thing I think that's ever happened to me.
Yeah, I wonder I imagine that there's like certain kinds of poems and like tones and styles that are probably easier to translate than others. And and your poems have this really, I want to say simple, but that's not the right word because they're not simple. They're they're just really, they're clean and they're direct in a way and just really vivid and kind of condensed, um, and funny, at least in English. So I wonder how, like, translating the humor in the poems, I wonder like what that might have been like. Do you have any experience with your translating? Is it difficult to translate humor into other languages?
I I don't think I've encountered any humor in the stuff that I translate. I translate my dad's poems, but I've been translating a lot from the Dominican Republic during the revolution in 1965. So not a lot of humor
Right.
in their civil war. But I did a reading and I recorded an event for the Miami Book Fair. So I've read with Nico twice, and so I can't quote him exactly, but he talked about kind of what you're saying, what he liked about my own poems and what he felt like he could connect with was like that clarity. He talked a lot about the imagery, right? Because I do use a lot of imagery, and so that was something that he could see in his mind's eye and understand, and then be able to replicate that in Spanish. So he talked a little bit about why he felt like he could translate the work well, and he did it well too. I mean, it's kind of cool, you know, to not in like an egotistical way. Like, it was great to hear somebody talk about how much they like my work.
Oh, that's the greatest thing in the world, though.
but it's kind of the best compliment when it comes from someone who's translated, because translating is such a bizarre thing. It's like my brain's not working. What's that thing where they try to turn lead into gold, right? Like alchemy, because, you know, it's the medium is the language, so they really have to replicate the thing using a totally different language. It's kind of amazing, and even more amazing to do it well.
So one thing I want to ask you, and then kind of the same inverse question back to Alysia. So for you, Ariel, I want to ask, do you also ever do prose? Did you start in poetry, or did you start in prose and move to poetry? And then Alysia, when he's done, if you can kind of take over. Have you always been writing in nonfiction? Did you start in fiction? Do you work in other forms? Do you do poems? So I just kind of want to hear about, if you do, and the differences between. So Ariel.
Yeah, I don't, almost like aggressively. I've I've wanted to, but I just can't. I've been very prose averse for a long time. I think any of my friends could like speak to that, and probably my teachers too, to be honest. And it's always been really difficult for me. And when I was in grad school, I'm back in grad school now for translation. When I was doing poetry, and when I felt like I finally figured it out, that's all I cared to read, right? So from like age 22 to 25, it was just all poetry all the time. And not exaggerating, I like sentences stopped making sense. Like even writing a response for a class or like a final paper, it was just like putting words in this order doesn't make any sense to me.
Mhm.
But I tried. A funny thing, at FIU, we had to take a cross-genre workshop, right? So all the poets had to take a fiction workshop, all the fiction people had to take a poetry workshop. I was really upset about having to take a fiction workshop. And the poem in my book, Eating Dinner Alone at the 163rd Street Mall, that was written immediately after leaving a fiction workshop one day. I was just in such a foul mood about having to do that. But I took a lyric essay class because I wanted to figure out how to crack prose. It wasn't fiction. I tried the lyric essay. I got nothing. I tried literary journalism. I took a literary journalism class and just couldn't, that didn't do much for me either. So I think this is kind of cheating, but I think my second genre is translating, and I only translate poetry pretty much.
Mhm.
So that's kind of a win-win for me, is that I still continue to engage with the only genre that really pulls me, but in a different way. But what's happening now is I have to now write like a forward to a translation collection, right? So now I still have to figure out at least some kind of prose thing and make it make sense. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I've tried. I think I wrote 2 very short stories in that fiction workshop. One about a UFO and one about the skunk ape. And I don't think my teacher was super happy with that. But yeah, I've been unable to, but I definitely have to write some kind of nonfiction mode now, and hopefully that goes well. But I've always wanted to write essays. Yeah, seems like it would make sense, but I still can't quite crack it. But I plan to, hopefully.
Yeah, the poet's essay collection or the poet's novel are big things right now, aren't they? The poet moving into prose is like a thing that I feel like that's happening a lot. But
Yeah.
Alysia,
and I'm going in the opposite direction.
Yeah, good for you.
Like, what's less profitable than poetry? Probably poetry and translation.
Alysia, same question, but the inverse to you.
Yeah, I've worked in many genres.
Mhm.
So I think, in high school I wrote poetry, but like, let's not talk about that.
Right.
In college, my undergrad is actually in fiction, mostly because like there wasn't a nonfiction track offered, but all my fiction was like fiction.
Mhm.
And then I got away from creative writing for a little while and got a master's, and then sort of like fell into a nonfiction writing class during my master's program, and I was just hooked. And when I applied to MFAs, I applied to both fiction and nonfiction. I only got into the nonfiction programs, so I took the hint. And my MFA was like pretty multi-genre. And so I've written in all the genres. Like I've written some poems that have been published. I think I struggle the most now with short stories, just because like plot is not like, what do you mean causality? Like cause and effect, like that's I don't really enjoy that. But I think sometimes, so I listened to Teresa Carmody in your conversation,
Mhm.
and I was thinking about I did do that, but why is this connecting in my mind? Something about Ocean Vuong's book, like, she mentioned the BuzzFeed poem.
And Ryan did, I think, actually.
Okay, yeah.
But yeah,
sorry.
it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And so I've read both. I've read the book, but and then I like listened to, anyway. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit scattered. What I'm trying to say is, when I first read On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, I read it as much more nonfiction than the way that he himself describes the process of writing it. And I found that to be very surprising. And so I think I have a lot of strong feelings also about like genre between fiction and nonfiction. But this is just to say, I think I've written in all the genres to some extent. I do prefer nonfiction and occasionally poetry. Would be like the succinct answer to the question.
So
wait, go ahead, Ryan.
I was going to say, so along the lines of genre fiction, nonfiction. There was a line in Notes from the Cliff Face that the best way I can explain it is it slapped me as I was reading, which was like kind of like I was like, I can't get too teachery, but I was like,
it's a very violent book.
No, but the line was something like, it's complicated even in medicine to parse truth from fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And it really just like stuck with me. And it was one of those sentences I had to take a breath with. And so I was wondering if you could kind of talk to that idea, both as a writer and a person with memory and nonfiction. If it's possible. I just
let me just like take a sip of water. No. So I think genre is dumb. Mostly because I think a lot of people take a lot of liberties when they write nonfiction. Like, I think genre is important to the extent that like I write nonfiction, and so what I write is true to the best of my ability.
Sure.
But like so many novels, especially like if you think like, you know, mid like 1900s type of novels were like not, you know, you could call them memoir. Probably. And I think that like the way that some people treat memoir could be treated as fictive for some, you know, accounts. Absolutely. And so like I don't know. And I think now more and more like the idea about like what a novel, air quotes, like should look like is sort of disintegrating, which I think is a great thing, to be clear. But so I feel like I'm getting away from your question. But the idea of like what is true and what is not true, it's like, you know, there's so much subjectivity, and it's hard to like parse, you know, the difference between like, okay, so I remember this thing happening when I was a kid, right? And like I tell my dad like this thing happened. My dad's like, that absolutely did not happen. What are you talking about? And my mom's like, I don't remember. That's different than like Holocaust deniers, right? Like, so you know, and I think like that's sort of the one of the like biggest sort of tensions that I think I'm constantly grappling with in my work is the idea that like I really, really want there to be just like one thing or the other. And I do not like the complication of like that in between space, but that is really like all we have. So, you know, trying to hold like those contrasting ideas in my mind at the same time as my life's work, maybe. I'm not really sure. But even on like an interpersonal level, like when you think about, or when I think about, so like that, I had a rule for myself. I have a rule for myself, which is never be petty in writing. And this is like bordering that because this is recorded, but I'm just going to go for it.
Do it.
So that house I was living in with all those people, one of them, I'm like trying to think out how to say this diplomatically. So like one of them used to like make racist jokes toward me, with occasional frequency. And like, I'm sure if you ask him, that is not at all like how he remembers that situation. Like, I'm sure it's not. Like, I'm sure he was just like, Alicia's a really jokey person. We joke around. Like, she's always mean. I was just joking. Like, 100%. I guarantee you, like, that's his opinion of his experience of reality, right? And so it's like, okay, you have all these people looking at the world and coming out with like a different understanding of what's happening. What do you do with that? And I think nonfiction is interesting because a lot of it, like the writing I do at least, tries to like take it apart, like all that looking. But it doesn't always make for like the most, let's say, smooth reading experience. You know what I mean? Like, how do you write a scene and at the same time acknowledge that like, did we record this? No. So how do we know this is what really happened?
Well, and also like the idea of like the other person involved in, I mean, Apology was a huge example of that for me, from Doctor's Notes to Mother to Friend and Nirvana. And so it's kind of crafting the author as a character through another lens too. So that was a really interesting kind of delve to kind of go into.
I don't know if you saw this, Amber Sparks I think it was Amber Sparks, but on Twitter recently, she's like, what's the most like on brand piece of art that like you did not create, but every time you read it, you're like, oh, I wish I had written that. And so one of mine is Jesus' Son by Dennis Johnson, whom I've met. So like, I don't claim to aspire to like his level of brilliance or anything like that, but just like, I love that book so much.
Yeah, it's really good.
Especially the end of that first car crash while hitchhiking, right? The end where there's like, and I talk about this line in my book.
Yeah, in the
right?
book.
The narrator breaks the fourth wall. And I think like that has like influenced like a lot of how I think about myself as a narrator in nonfiction, is just like that moment where like the guy like is just like, what do you want from me? Yeah, so that's kind of
what's the line again? You stupid people.
You expect me to help you? Yeah, it's here.
Yes, it says that in the book, right? That you have
it does.
So one question I have also for both of you is about persona versus person in your work. So I know, like for instance, Ariel, I know you've admitted to your work being autobiographical. So I guess for both of you, my one question I have is, to what degree is the you in Ariel, your poems, and Alysia in your essays, to what degree is the you, and then to what degree is it a construction of you, if that makes sense? Whoever wants to jump in is fine.
I think, and this might not make sense, but I think it's both at the same time, you know? It's kind of like social media, where it's like, yeah, this is a picture of me and maybe this happened, but like, you know, when you post it and how it's still very constructed, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like my poems, like, they're pretty much all autobiographical, but where the changes are kind of mundane. So like I think the most egregious example is the poem about letting the alligator cross the street. That happened to my dad. He just sent me a picture of it. And I was like, oh, this would make for a cool poem, but it won't make any sense in the book if I write it from my dad's point of view, because that doesn't add anything. So I just swapped this out, which on the surface might seem egregious, but really the poem is about the alligator, right? And the kind of visual that creates. So I make those kind of changes. And to Alicia's point earlier, I talk to my dad a lot. And my dad could have been a stand-up comedian. I mean, he just loves having an audience. He'll tell stories and anecdotes constantly. And he's always been this way. And so I might write a poem based on something he told me 15 years ago. And I don't ask for clarification. I don't ask for details when I write it. I write it as I remember it. And I think because it's a poem, I can definitely get away with more, because the question of real or not isn't asked as much. But that's something that I do. And then I end up, you know, sometimes it's totally off. So like in my first book, I have a poem imagining my grandfather, my dad's dad, who came here from the Dominican Republic. I have a poem imagining him walking from the Bronx all the way down through Manhattan, kind of looking for a job, because I knew where his first job was. I forget it now, but it was some hotel in like Midtown. But I didn't know where my grandfather had come to in New York. I had assumed it was the Bronx, because that's where I was born and that's where my parents met and that's kind of where our family came from. But he came to Brooklyn. And so like that I thought, I was like, oh, I'll reimagine it, and that's a kind of nonfiction. But really it just ended up being totally fiction, because I didn't even have that information to work with. But yeah, it's definitely both. It's definitely a version of me that is constructed, but it's not, where it deviates, it's not meant to fool anyone, you know. It's not meant to like hide anything. It's kind of meant to, you know, it's hopefully very obviously like I'm this very limited person and I'm constantly the unreliable narrator, and everything you see is filtered through you know, my point of view, because what I do want is for the poems to accumulate in some way, right? For reader to be like, the I in this poem is the same I in that poem is the same I, and you know, that's kind of something I strive for sure.
Alysia?
Yeah, the social media, I really liked that comparison. Yeah, I think I think about the narrator in my essays as like a facet of my personality, not, you know, and just like the way I act or the way I should act at work is different than the way I'll act at home, right? You know, it's the same sort of thing. And so like on the page, I'm much more thoughtful and sincere than I will ever allow myself to be in front of most people in real life. And that's just kind of like the truth of it. You know, but in terms of like, I forget who said this. Lee Gutkind, maybe somebody very, you know, fancy in nonfiction. But he called it, you know, it's the making of, not the making up. And so it's like, okay, how do you make meaning out of what's been given to you? And I'm a big believer in like tipping my hand when I'm doing something that's not, when I'm imagining something or I'm putting something together. But yeah, it's always me. I think the most persona-y poem essay in my collection is Withdrawal, where it's like the doctor's voices. But I felt really comfortable doing that just because like it was so obviously not a deceit. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like people aren't going to read it and think like, oh wow, she got 4 doctors to all write this one document together. Like no one thinks that. So I felt okay with doing that.
Yeah, and compositing is such a useful tool, I think, in literature. And like kind of to Ariel's point earlier, like sometimes some things just work better in the first person. Like if it's something that happened that's adjacent, that was really interesting, sometimes on the page or even in comedy, almost especially in comedy, it just works better from the I perspective because the audience just has so much more room for relating to it, but also just like, I don't know, I think I'm trying to say like, when I read, I want to feel in a way a direct connection to the writer. Even when I read fiction in the third person, somehow I still kind of feel that way, like that there's no one else around. And so I think sometimes moving things into the first that didn't actually happen to you is just a tool to keep this kind of, I don't want to say fake, but like a fake closeness between the writer and the reader, if that makes any sense.
I mean, it's like that intimacy that you want, of feeling like you're putting your head under the water. And that's like what reading a good book is like. Like you put it down, you're like coming up for air, you know?
Yeah, especially I think, which is something that we're both doing. I think when you have a book made up of smaller pieces that you all want to be connected and to build something larger in the book, right? You have to kind of maintain, when you get close, you can't pull too far away, right? By having that third person or like too far away from that perspective that you've built.
So this is along the lines of like persona and just kind of seeing yourself on the page. I was in a call with Jessica Jacobs and Nicole Brown last night about the persona, and they were talking about the importance of defamiliarization with yourself, because you're so used to seeing yourself, and kind of seeing yourself as a character in fiction almost will help that. And we talked about, it sounds so kind of abstract, but like, what is your face beside just your face? And so my question, well, what struck me is that correlating with the essay Inheritance, Alysia, and I'm so curious just on a personal level with the photos and how they kind of landed in your collection and what that process was like.
Yeah, so I knew I needed to write a chapter/essay about my family. What I was going to write about went through a number of different iterations, because even though, like, you know, my mom pops up like in an apology, for example, but you know, the genetic aspect of like mental illness, or like the, environmental aspect of like mental illness is like something that I felt I could not just like leave out of my book about misdiagnosed mental illness. So part of it is like, I don't want to say a dodge, but like kind of a dodge, and that like I might write nonfiction, but like that doesn't mean I'm going to tell you everything about my life or like put people on blast in a way that like I'm not comfortable with. So part of it is a dodge. But in terms of like the actual photos themselves, I don't know if this is like a biracial kid thing or what, but at one of the many AWPs that I cannot parse out anymore, Izzy Garcia, who has a new chapbook out, by the way, called Homegrown Fairy Tale, she was on a panel with a couple other people, and it was like about mixed race writing. And it was the first time in my life that I had been in a room full of people who looked like me. And the experience was just like so arresting. Like even now I'm like shaking, like almost gonna cry thinking about it.
Wow.
So it just never happened to me before. And so to me, the idea of like not really fitting in has always been like a physical manifestation and not something that like is hideable. That's not a word, but that's okay.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's not a piece of writing. You can make up words on a podcast.
And also because people who have met my parents, like especially my dad, are always shocked when they meet my dad, because my dad, unless you have my mom also, like looks nothing like me. Like you need both of them to like make sense.
Right.
And so it's just something I've always sort of known about myself. And so as I started like piecing together these ideas about like, all right, so what do we literally like inherit from our families? It's just impossible like not to talk about the body, right? Especially when you're talking about the mind as well. So that's how that happened. Just in terms of like why I chose to incorporate the images, like I said, I went to a multi-genre MFA, and like one of the genres, we had a cartoonist who was one of the faculty who was amazing. So I got to take like cartooning classes. So,
cool.
My approach to writing has always been very much just like, make cool stuff, man. What do you want to make?
Yeah.
And
Hell
that's,
yeah.
that's just kind of like my ethos when it comes to like making things like that. So I did ask my parents permission to put their photos in. My grandmother is dead, and I did not ask my aunt actually. So we'll see how that turns out. But
and I think the photos are something that also kind of in a way increased that intimacy that we were kind of talking about before. Like I always think of the term now, parasocial relationship. I don't know if you're all familiar with that term, but it's like the term like where you feel really close to someone you don't actually know, and so they can't reciprocate it at all, but you still think about it. So like certain like podcasts, for instance, not necessarily this one, right? But like I think of like Mark Maron. I don't if you're familiar with him and his podcast, where he has like a level of confession and like a level of candidness that as a listener, and like you kind of see his fans, like there's like this like, I don't know if he's the best example. I mean, there's a million examples I could think of, most essayists and many poets that also kind of bring this out in people, where you feel like you know them in a way, and you have some sort of like empathy, and almost in a way love, but it's not love because it's unreciprocated and you don't really know them. You just know the kind of construction. And so I think kind of photos sometimes when I've seen them in essays almost increase that, because for so many people, like photos feel so real. Like, I don't know. Do you understand what I'm getting at? Am I?
I think I do. Like Susan Sontag has that like on photography essay. I think also like for me, part of it was that old impulse where like, I don't know if you like maybe like the early 2000s, the nonfiction books would always have this like in the middle, this like insert of like a couple slick pages, and it would all be like photos.
Oh yeah.
The glossy.
Yeah. So that was part of like also what I was, pulling from in this idea. I don't know. That's just, those are the books I grew up reading where like, even if they're really like dense, like I remember reading a book about like Tsar Alexander, right? Or whatever. And like in the middle, you still have pictures of like all the princesses and stuff. And so it didn't seem totally out of place to me if you're talking about people, to then include that. And there's something I wanted to ask Ariel that was related to this, which is now escaping me. But it was also like, just thinking about like that false sense of intimacy. Like I think to write nonfiction and to write autobiography with distance, like you need to have your shit together. Like you have to be able to have some sort of like ability to look at yourself objectively, or otherwise like if you've been in a creative writing workshop, this might have happened to you. Like, you read somebody's work and you're like, I don't know what to say because it's not a craft problem. The problem is like, you're wrong. Like your basic understanding, your premise of life is incorrect. Clearly. Tell me if I'm wrong.
That's useful feedback.
I think this has happened to you.
Yeah. No, you're definitely right.
Are there any writers for both of you, I guess, where you feel like you have that kind of parasocial relationship where like that really kind of strike that chord in you in a way? Like, because one of the thing about the parasocial relationship that's so interesting to me is like there's like a falsity to it, right? It's not a relationship, but at the same time there's like a level of healing that can happen, or like a level of I don't think healing is the right word, but it's like a level like that intimacy, that like false intimacy you get from the page can really do something to you and really open you up and like teach you to be vulnerable in certain ways, if you understand what I'm getting at. Are there any and if you can't, it's fine. Are there any writers you can think of where when you read them, you kind of feel that weird, like intimate comfort that kind of like, it's not you, but it almost feels like it could be?
Well, I think this is cheating a little bit because she was one of my teachers, but Denise Duhamel's work, I think, does that for me as a poet. Because she does, and she's been writing for a long time now. So when I read her first book that came out in 1993, right? She has that very consistent eye for the most part. That's where I learned that from. And then I read like her most recent book, and it's like, oh, this is the same eye 30 years later. Like that's super, super interesting. And not to like impose it that that's the real person, but even just reading it, it's like, oh wow, this is like that kind of continuity is kind of amazing to me. Yeah, I don't know if that like really answers the question. The other person is Patti Smith, with from Just Kids. Like, I don't know. I just want to give her a hug. Like, I just hope to like run into Patti Smith one day somewhere in New York City.
Yeah. And then she'll be like, what the fuck are you doing? But I know you because I read the book. Can you think of anything, Alysia? It's okay if you can't.
No, I can think of a lot, which is why I'm making this face, actually. I would say like one of the big ones is Carmen Machado. Like I loved her Body and Other Parties, and I loved her essays. And then I read In the Dream House, and then I like read her perfume reviews in I forget what that magazine that just Vanity Fair maybe. And she like did a thing in Eater recently about like her polyamorous relationship, and they're like cooking food, and I just like, I'm kind of in love with Carmen Machado is what I'm trying to say. And yeah, she's absolutely like one of the big ones where like, and I would never like, and I've heard her read before, like at Politics and Prose. And it was just like, it took everything I had to like, not like, I'm just like sitting in the audience, like, don't squeal. This is fine. Don't squeal. Give her space, being a total fucking weirdo. So yes, the short answer.
Yeah. I kind of, in both of your answers, I find it interesting that it's people you mentioned who have multiple books, right? And I almost wonder if like how that feeling is something that happens over time in terms of body of work rather than just one book. Or like in the example I gave about like the podcast, it's not like one podcast that makes me feel a certain way. It's like the amount of time I've spent and the amount of opportunities I've had to be able to do that. So I guess I'm going to turn this into a question. And that question is kind of, do you view, or I don't want to say do you view, because it's not really a yes or no answer. To what degree, maybe when you think about yourself as a writer, or you think about the pieces you write, maybe just a poem or just an essay or a book of poems or a book of essays, maybe to what degree do you think about your writing as a body of work versus a thing that you're writing in that moment? So either one of you, if you feel like you can jump in on that.
Well, I always do, and when I was younger, to almost like a comical extent, I would keep everything I wrote in a folder called the collected poems. Yeah, so I just kind of always do. It's kind of interesting, even in like a short amount of time, because it's fun to imagine like somebody in 100 years, like however, if I died tomorrow, I still have 2 books. For somebody to like read your work as a whole, right? With poets in particular, because eventually, or I mean, at least with some of them, you read, they get like the collected works that comes out, and some people read that. Like me, I read Allen Ginsberg. I didn't read Howl or any of the little books. I read like the whole thing front to back. Same with like James Wright, same with Sylvia Plath. And it does like change the way that you receive the work. But it's also super interesting to look at it kind of, I don't know if critically is the right word, but to look at the way somebody's work changed over time, especially if you love their work. It's kind of just fascinating to look at what they were doing in this period of time, how that changed, if they were successful, right, with a certain book, and then what comes after that. Especially if it's someone like Plath or like Kafka, who I also love, who, we have like their letters and their diaries to like read that parallel to what they were producing at the time. And I took a summer workshop once with Carolyn Forche, and she advised us, I think I was like 22, we were mostly like undergrads. And she said, you should always be reading all the time, but what you should do like in the summer, since we were students, presumably would have the summer off, is spend the whole summer with like one writer and just read like kind of as much of them as you can to get that kind of larger scope. And I've always found that to be super interesting, but also just like, I don't know if useful is the right word. And I know it's kind of insane to like think about work that you haven't written yet, not in a creative way, but just like imagining. But it's also kind of interesting because it changes, right? When you produce a new thing, you do add it on to like what you've produced so far, right? And that can change. It can kind of resonate backwards in a different way and alter the previous work, or at least the way it's perceived. So yeah, I do definitely think about that. But I'm aware that it is kind of insane and crazy.
I guess in a way, kind of to your point, like the body of work almost creates its own narrative arc.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I think individual pieces do that too. I mean, I'm sure like essays and poems, sometimes you're like, oh, I thought we were going this way, but we're going this way now. Okay, I guess we're going wherever the thing wants to go sometimes.
That makes me think of a question, which I'm going to try to remember because I want to hear Alicia's answer. And then after, I'll see if I remember this question. But go ahead, Alysia.
Well, now I'm thinking about like writers who's like, I've sort of read en masse, and like there's not very many. And I wonder if it's like a prose versus, because like sometimes I feel like I could literally spend my life reading and I would still have books left unread that I wanted to read. But like Faulkner, Kundera, Calvino, Maggie Nelson, and Helen Oyeyemi are like probably the only 5. Oh, and Dennis Johnson. So there's like 6 writers who I can like confidently say like I've read most of their work. But I think that's really it. But I also always forget stuff. But I'm thinking about that. I don't think about things a lot.
That's going to be the quote we put for you. I don't think about things a lot.
About things a lot. Yeah, I mean, I sort of, like, I remember being 25 and living in Indiana. And at the time, the person I was dating, like, owned their own house. And it just like came up. They were like, well, where do you want to be in 5 years? And I just kind of like blinked and I was like, I really thought I'd be dead by the time I turned 30. Like, I really haven't done a lot of long-term planning. And so part of like this decade of my life has been like this strange sort of realization and like relief and also terror that I am very likely going to continue to live for a number of years. And what am I going to do with this time that I have on this earth? And so with my work, like, I'm working on a second book project, but I also have like all these little things floating around that don't necessarily cohere to one another. And I still want them to like exist in some fashion, even if they don't cohere. But yeah, no, I'm not real good with like the long-term planning. That's not a strong suit of mine.
I guess for you, it'll just kind of take care of itself. Let's see if I can remember the question I had, and then I will stop asking so many questions so Ryan can ask a question. Sorry, Ryan. My question is like, for Alysia, like for those 6, and Ariel for however many that you've read, a large body of work, where do you start? Do you start at the newest and go backward? Do you start at the first and go forward? Do you start in the middle and bounce around?
I am the most chaotic good person. Like, I'm so firmly chaotic good. Like, I don't start I start where I found a book and I liked it and I'm like, oh, cool. Let me get the next one. And the next one is like whatever I run into at a used bookstore next. I'm not a very methodical person, or it's like, what's available at the public library. So that's my method.
Yeah, that's a good one. Ariel, do you have a method, quote unquote, or
No, it's similar. It depends how I encounter them. If I find someone and they have a book that I really like, and I'm like, oh, I should read. My reaction, as you can see, is to try to find everything I can by someone when I like their work.
He's pointing to a lot of books, by the way.
Yeah. My dad has, I think, twice as many books as I do.
Wow, I can't imagine.
He has like a little over 3,000.
Oh my god.
Yeah, and that's the kind of house I grew up in. So it's like, I've always wanted to like have my own library, and like because I work kind of chaotically. Let's just like show you my desk really quick. It's just like. And then even though I live in a studio, I got myself like a little library cart because I always wanted one.
Wow, your entire apartment
I'm
is
jealous.
just books everywhere.
But that over there, that's like on my left and on my right are my to read piles.
Wow, yeah.
So it is very chaotic. But sometimes I think with poetry, because things are shorter, there are poets that's like, oh, like you kind of have to read them, or like, people will like keep telling you that you should read this person, and then you might read a poem and they're like, oh yeah, I should read them, and then their collected poems is like this, and it's like, well, all right, we'll start from page 1 and kind of go through there, which is not a good idea. I gave up on like that's how I read Ginsberg when I was like 21. It's like, oh, and his collected is like 1,000 pages. It's like, yeah, let me just read this front to back, and that I ended up like hating him and putting it down for a year and be like, no, wait, but people like Allen Ginsberg, I should keep reading this. And so, yeah, my methods are again, like intense, but sloppy. I get a lot of reading done, but it's sometimes just whatever I can literally get my hands on. Yeah.
Ryan, do you have a method or do you just kind of jump in? I don't know.
My stack, whatever calls out to me.
Yeah.
It's never.
I don't have one. I was just wondering if everyone else.
I have one last question, and it is inspired from what Alysia said. with ideas floating around constantly, just everywhere. I was just talking to my grandma today on the phone, and she's like, "What are you writing?" I'm like, "Hell if I know." I'm just, everything. And we were talking about this last week in the intro, Michael, and I was thinking to myself about like when ideas come, what to do with them. So I have a very specific and kind of simple process question, which is, do you carry a journal, and do you make note when an idea comes to you immediately versus do you let it sit and then express itself within and then get it out on the page?
Good question.
I do. Again, well, I don't know if I can move again, but like all my journals are over here. And that's how I was a really bad student, not to like go on forever. But I was a very terrible undergraduate student. And when I was finishing undergrad, when I was 21 going on 22, I had like no plan. I was like going to finish college and didn't know what I was going to do. And I wasn't writing poetry outside of workshop, which I know sounds kind of insane, but that's why I started keeping notebooks. I was like, if you're going to be a writer, you actually have to do it and not just like turn it in for homework. So I keep notebooks pretty meticulously, and they're kind of, again, chaotic. I date them, so it's like a journal, but anything, I just write it down. If I have an idea, I write it down. If I think of an image or a line, even just a word, if I'm like watching TV or reading something, I'm like, oh, that's an interesting word. Use that in a poem. I'll like write that down. But then the hard part is like revisiting the notebook. So I'll write down everything.
Right.
But then when it comes time to write, sometimes I'm like, I don't want to look at the other stuff that I wrote down in there.
And Alysia?
I'm a notebook keeper, but not for that. I am like a bit of a freak with to-do lists. So that's what my notebooks are for.
That's what mine's like too.
Yes.
Yeah. Like I have a Google Calendar and a notebook. It's pretty bad. I'm sporadic. I actually use the notes on my phone.
I do too.
Yeah, just because like it usually happens late at night, and like I don't want to wake up my partner who's like really sensitive to light. And like sometimes, I learned the hard way. It was actually when I was revising my book, and I want you all to know I've never told anybody this, so you're all getting look. We're having a parasocial moment now. I had a moment like falling asleep where I was like, this is what the fucking title of my book should be. I'll remember it tomorrow.
It's gone.
It's gone. So that was like a year or so ago. And so that was when I was finally like, I'd always sporadically written it down, but at that point I like sort of committed where I was like, all right, bitch, like if you have a good idea, you really need to write it down. There's none of this, oh yeah, I'll remember it. Yeah, I use the notes app on my phone.
Cool.
Yeah, I was like really adverse to using my phone to write, and then I started to, and I was like, this is amazing. Because I have 2 kids, so sometimes it's like I have an idea and there's just like so much shit going on sometimes, and I'm just like just do this real fast, and then I can just kind of like slip it back away. Anyway,
Yeah.
so I definitely relate to that.
I did a voice memo at a red light one time, and since that day it just went on,
Voice memos, I quit smoking about a year ago, so I don't do this anymore, but when I used to smoke cigarettes, I would drive around and just smoke. It was like one of my favorite things to do. And just like think. And sometimes I would sometimes there would be voice memos while driving, but that hasn't happened since I quit smoking.
I'm going to show, I have like a notebook right here. I'm going to like, speaking of chaos, like that's like what a notebook like looks like for me. So it's like, if I'm right here at my desk, I'll probably do it instead of on my phone. But yeah, the chaos is real. So it's almost like the phone is like, helps you kind of as an organizing principle, but at the same time, I kind of like the chaos of the traditional notebook.
I'm looking for, I can't find it. It's probably like on the coffee table, but I did start keeping a commonplace book finally.
I've heard of I've only heard that phrase like in the last couple months. So if any listeners don't know the phrase, would you explain what a commonplace book is?
Yeah. Well, so it like goes back to like a bunch of like ancient Greek stuff, whatever. But right now, basically all it means is that like I'm keeping track of the books that I read in such a way that like, so this is just my particular process. Is there are a couple of books that I'm reading specifically for my nourishment as a writer, and then I have books that I just like, I don't want to say just read for funsies because I think it all nourishes me as a writer, but some I read with intention.
Right.
And I'm a monster, like I said, chaotic good, so I dog ear the pages as I'm reading when I'm like, oh, that's a great line. And then when I finish the book, I go back and I reread the dog-eared pages, and I actually write by hand the like sentences. I'll copy them down that I want to keep. If it's a big section, like I'm reading Raske's The Book of Delights right now, and like some of those I'm just gonna photocopy because like I'm not gonna copy 2 pages. But so that's how I'm using my commonplace book. Do you do that, Ariel? I know you.
Yeah. So my notebooks are again like very organized and chaotic. So I keep track of everything that I read, but because everything is like dated and time stamped, it becomes super. So if I look back at an old notebook to like see what I was doing out there, what I was working on, and it'll be like reading Kafka's Diaries, and it's like 2:45 a.m. You know. So it creates this kind of, and then the next thing will be like a thought for a poem. So like it helps me remember or maybe even realize how things occur to me sometimes, you know. So it everything is kind of in my notebook, and I also like write quotes longhand, and I started keeping another one. So I started keeping a quote book of like the quotes that I write down, but also like when I wrote them. So like I think in like 2015 I only wrote down one quote, you know, so it seems like really dramatic to look at it like that's the only thing.
Do you remember what the quote was? Because it must be a very important quote if you only wrote
down. Well, it probably, like, that's the thing, it probably wasn't. It's
yeah, right.
I think it was 2014 where it's just there's 2. There's one from Chase Twitchell. It's like the ending part of a poem. Whenever I look out at the snowy mountains at this hour and speak directly into the ear of the sky, it's you I'm thinking of. I think I was very much in love at that point. And then the only other one, and these are both from January. This is January 3rd and January 6th, and then there was nothing else. And this one is
sounds like a New Year's resolution gone awry.
Or the failure of one, I think. Yeah. The second quote is, "We are nothing but a poet's dream." So this very dramatic 24-year-old me, that's the only things that were worth writing down in all of 2014 for me.
Well, maybe we are nothing but a poet's dream. Or an essayist's dream.
Thank you for listening to our episode with Ariel and Alysia. Don't forget to look at our YouTube page to see their readings. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and check out our magazine online as well.
Yep. And both those books that Ariel and Alysia came out with this year were from Burrow Press, who is taking subscriptions for their 2021 catalog, which I am a subscriber to, and I'm very excited for it.
I know.
So join us as
One
subscribers.
of us. One of us.
Goodbye.